Hey guys, how's it going? Kevin Cleary here with a knife video for you. And today we're taking a look at this really cool little fixed blade from Bark River. This, if you're not familiar with it, is the Bark River Tusk, which is a new model for this year. Now, I guess there's a little bit of backstory there. I guess the Tusk started out as a regrind of a different model, the Fox River. Now it's like its own thing. So that's really what's new, more so than this is a completely new model. I'm pretty glad that they started doing this as its own knife, because I wasn't in love with, the Fox River regrind had a bit of a weird blade shape to it. This is much more of a traditional Wharncliffe, and I definitely like that. I also love, and here's the thing, guys, Bark River knives, they have so many handle materials available that it can be really, really tough. I decided that I wanted to pick up a Tusk, and it honestly took me days and days to kind of figure out which one I actually wanted. I ended up going with the linen micarta in the black and green layers. So I really, really like the look of this. I love the feel of it in hand. I may try some others along the way. I do have a canvas micarta at Bark River as well. But I will try some others along the way, and eventually I'd like to get like a really dressy one in C-Tech or something like that, or some of the really interesting woods that they've got with the blues and bronze and gold and stuff like that. Anyway, I'm totally off topic at this point, so let's get back to what we're talking about, and that is this knife right here. As I was saying, I do find this to be very, very attractive. And I can tell you from having this for quite some time now, I also find it to be highly useful. So let me go ahead and start telling you a little bit about this knife. This guy is 7 5/16 overall. Now, probably some of you listening are going, Kevin, that knife is way too small for you. And if this was a folder, that would be true. There are two things, though, I have to say about this. I have no idea why, and I cannot explain it, but I'm a little more forgiving of Wharncliffe blades. Like, for example, I love the Spyderco Yojimbo, one of my favorite Spydercos, and it's a Wharncliffe. And the blade length is definitely shorter. I have no idea why I feel that way. It's purely subjective. Okay, I can't really tell you, quantify my my preference in any way. It is what it is. Okay, so let's go ahead and continue with this knife. By the way, I do love this handle, and if there was a variant of this that kind of finished off with a drop point or something, I think that would be a knife worth buying as well. Anyway, let's get back to what we were talking about. Size and weight, 7 5/16 overall on this guy, 3 1/16 on the blade. So like just barely breaks that 3-inch mark. 4 1/8 on the overall handle length. Now, one thing that some of you really like is the grip area. So this is a little shorter. Okay, you can see this knife almost totally disappears in my hand. That's what I was doing there. The grip area here is only 3.5 inches. So that's measured from here to here. If you had like massive, huge hands, I guess it would be possible. You'd get your pinky floating out here, but 3.5 inches is quite a bit. And I can't imagine someone not being able to get a full grip on this knife. Although, I'm sure, I don't know, Shaquille O'Neal or something probably couldn't do it. So that's grip area. Now, the weight on this guy is a little heavier, 4.9 ounces on the knife itself. And you can see that's pretty thick blade stock there. And then when you add the sheath, you've got another 1.5 ounces. All right, so that's what you're dealing with there, I should say. And one other thing I want to point out is that when you put this knife in the sheath, it's going to be 8 1/4 inches overall. So that's the length here. And that's going to be an important number to keep in mind, because a lot of people are probably going to want to carry this the way that I do, which is I just take this knife, sheath and all, and drop it directly in my front right pocket, just like I was carrying a folder. Now, the other variation that I use often when I'm doing an in-pocket carry with this is the high hip pockets that I have on the 511 jeans and the 511 Ridgeline pants. I will put this in that sort of higher up hip pocket. I find it carries really nicely there as well. So those are the two sort of in-pocket options. And of course you do have a loop here, so you can put this on a belt. And I have carried this on a belt a number of times. I wear a belt sort of sporadically. So that's something that for me, the loop like this is not my favorite way of carrying a fixed blade. I prefer something more like this, where I've got a clip that I can clip onto a whole bunch of different things. And I brought this sheath specifically to show you that. All right, so let's get this guy back out of the sheath. now that we've talked about how it carries, and talk a little bit about the blade itself. So this is A2 blade steel, A2 tool steel on the blade with a convex grind, and as you can see, a Wharncliffe blade shape, hardened to 62 Rockwell, which, you know, you can look on Knife Ship Free or even Bark River's website, and a lot of them will say that they're hardened to 62 Rockwell, which is really hardened. So edge retention on this and toughness and durability, very, very impressive. And that's because of two things. One, A2 is a good steel, but the other thing that we've really got to talk about with this blade is the convex grind. And that, guys, should be easy to see if I hold this knife like this. So you can really see that on this knife, hopefully getting to focus right. You can really see the rounded edge right there. And that comes down to a very, very thin edge right behind the actual cutting edge here, super, super thin. And that makes this knife perform really, really nicely. Because of that thin edge geometry, it bites into material super well. And I've got to say, one of my favorite things about this knife is the fact that it cuts really well, even though you've got this big, thick, hefty blade stock. And, you know, I have a bunch of knives like that. You know, we could talk about the Cold Steel 4MAX or the Curtis F3 or any number of other knives where, you know, I like that thick, hefty blade stock, but I still want the knife to cut. And, you know, what I really like is that this is an interesting way. Normally, I would say if you want a blade stock that's really thick to cut well, you know, you should put a hollow grind on it. This is the exact opposite of a hollow grind, and yet it works fantastic. It really, really does. And so in terms of cutting performance as a utility blade, this is outstanding. And for, you know, 95% of EDC tasks, again, works really, really well. The one sort of limitation, if you will, is that thick blade stock and that wedge effect, meaning that, you know, you're not going to get great performance, say, cutting apples with this or something like that. Otherwise, though, all the other things that I've had to cut with this, it just performs really, really nicely. So in terms of, you know, what do I think of this blade? Yeah, I'm a huge fan, with that limitation that it is pretty thick, and so you're not going to be cutting up apples or slicing, you know, fine slices of, I don't know, truffles or something. Otherwise, it's great for EDC tasks, especially for heavy duty EDC tasks. It's fantastic. And that's, you know, a fixed blade is, you know, one of the reasons you carry a fixed blade is that extra utility, that extra strength. And so, yeah, huge fan of this blade. Finally, let's move on to the handle, or I guess next, not finally. You can see that thick blade stock does go all the way to the end of the knife. And we have that very handsome linen micarta with the black and green, and this is the matte finish rather than the polish finish. If you went back a couple days ago, how long ago was it now? Anyway, not too long ago, I posted a review of the Bark River Bravo Vortex, which had the exact same handle material with a polished finish. I'm going to say, you know, if you go back and look at that knife versus this knife, I actually like the matte finish just a little bit better. It, to me, feels a little bit grippier. Maybe that's all in my imagination, but even the look of it, I definitely prefer. By the way, it's hard to comment too much on the handle material here because as you know, if you go on, you know, Knife Ship Free or any other site that sells Bark River knives, there's like a ton of handles on these. So you can get all kinds of different materials that are going to have slightly different feel in hand depending on what finish you get and what material you get. What I can comment is feel in hand, and that is very good. It's big enough to be hand filling. This nice thick pommel here really sort of rests it into the palm well. And in a saber grip, this is just really, really comfortable. And this is how I use the knife probably 85% of the time. If you do have to sort of go into a hammer grip and maybe do some push cutting like this, it's really good. One of the things that I find a knife will fail there is if this is not thick enough. And we talked about this with the JX6. If this isn't thick enough, you'll get some movement, but this is nice and big and really fills your hand up so you can get some good cutting done that way. In terms of a reverse grip, pretty good. The way this pommel is, it's not ideal because there's no real flat spot for your thumb to go unless you wrap it right around. Okay, so see how I'm bringing that all the way over? That's what I'm talking about. And honestly, guys, I rarely ever have a reason to use a knife in reverse grip, so it's not the biggest deal for me how it works in that grip, but I know some people like to know about that, so I always mention it. There is a lanyard hole here, not very big, and I'm not 100% sure whether or not you could get 550 cord through here or not. It would be really, really close. If someone has one and has put 550 cord through, comment down in the description box below. Now, let's move on to the sheath. So we have a pretty standard Bark River sheath here where a lot of the handle goes into the sheath. That's something they often do. And of course, it's just the sewn leather. Now, what am I going to say about this? I like this sheath just fine. And the way I carry the knife in pocket, just slipped into my right front pocket or into that high hip pocket I was telling you about, works just fine like that. It also works fine on a belt. The only problem is the way it's just the loop over attachment. I'm not a fan of this. I like the ability to clip and unclip my knife as I want. Now, this carries high enough that sitting in the car, you know, this isn't jamming down into the car seat and making life uncomfortable, but still I would prefer the option to be able to unclip this from my belt, set it down, and you know, sit down in the car or something like that, because it can be a little obtrusive from time to time. For that reason, I wish this were a Kydex sheath, and I wish it had a configuration like this. This is my favorite sheath system I've ever seen. This is from Rake Knives, from their 815, but there are a number of other places you can get this. Some Real Steel knives have it as well. It's just a really, really good system that allows you to put your knife in any configuration that you want it. So I wanted to bring that in to show you, because this is my favorite way of carrying a knife. Now, of course, this is plastic rather than Kydex. I wish it were Kydex, and then this would be the most ideal situation imaginable. So that's my take on the sheath. It's definitely very functional. The retention is nice. I have treated this a little bit. So I wetted this down and squeezed it all around the knife and kind of left it for a couple of days like that to break it in a little, if you will. So now that we've got that covered, let's go ahead and get to some comparisons. So let's pull the knife out. I'll keep the sheath here just in case I feel like mentioning that. The first comparison, and probably the most obvious one, is going to be the other Bark River small EDC knife that I have, and that is the JX6. And we have the sheath here. Now, I reviewed this not that long ago, so you can go and look over there for my comments on the sheath. They have some of the same challenges and some of the same benefits. Another knife here that I want to bring in because it's equally gorgeous and impressive is this LT Wright Gen 2. Absolutely beautiful. A little bit more blade there to deal with, similar handle size. I will say that these handles kind of remind me of each other. So if you're familiar at all with this knife, if you know what it feels like in the hand, just very rounded, very comfortable. And I find this handle feels wonderful in hand, even a little bit better than this one. Although it's hard to say that. This is not my knife, but man, it is an impressive, impressive knife. So I wanted to bring that in for a quick comparison. Of course, there's a little more detail going on here, making this a slightly more attractive knife. Again, we've got the leather sheath, and I think this sheath, the retention is a little better on this sheath, but it's still the loop over clip. Next up, I've got a couple more for you, but this is one of my all-time favorite fixed blades. I find the size, the weight, the ease of carry, everything on this knife is really, really good. And this knife, you know, it's weird to even be comparing these. You know, I think this is like 40 bucks. And it is a great EDC fixed blade, one of my favorites. The great thing about this knife is the fact that at the Real Bush Monkey, Scotty was willing to make me this really awesome sheath that has a bit of my logo tied into it there. So this is how I carry this knife. I don't have a pen or anything in here. I should. I just haven't thought of anything that I want to put in there. But there is the Rake 815. And I should have two more for you here. Oh yeah, the Charade. This is the SCH F55. Again, a similar sort of style, short, stocky knife. The 55, however, is the cutting performance on it is not great. It's so thick behind the edge that I'm not a huge fan of this knife, unless you need a pry bar, which I normally don't need in that size. And then last but not least is going to be the Tops T-bow. The sheath on the T-bow I love because it's Kydex. I wish it had some kind of a thumb ramp here, but it doesn't. But this is a knife I think probably some of you are familiar with. It's a little smaller. I would call this the next size down. this could almost be a neck knife, and it probably is marketed as a neck knife, and I just don't like. To me, this is way too big to be a neck knife. Really, almost anything is too big to be a neck knife, but probably some of you are familiar with the Tops T-bow and how it carries. I carry this the same as this, just dropping it into my front pocket. Okay, so there's our comparisons out of the way. Let's get to a final conclusion on this very cool little Bark River fixed blade. If you haven't caught on by now, I really, really like this knife. I find it highly useful, highly attractive in terms of its design and certainly the handle material. The sheath is not my favorite thing in the world, but it's certainly more than functional, so I have no big issue with that. I highly recommend this knife. I really, really enjoy it. The one thing I would say is, I guess the two things I would say is, number one, there are whole bunches of variation on this. So maybe you don't like my handle material. There are tons of others, and that's true of most Bark River knives. The other thing is, if you do a lot of food prep with your EDC fixed blade, this is probably not your best option, because that thick blade stock means that certain foods, anything that's, an apple or a pear or anything that you're going to slice through, this is not going to be your best option. There you go, guys. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will talk to you soon.